When a presidential candidate selects their vice presidential running mate, it usually doesn't create much of a stir. But in 1836, Martin Van Buren's controversial vice presidential candidate, along with a few faithless electors, led to the only time that the Senate, using the 12th Amendment, selected the vice president. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson anointed his vice president, Martin Van Buren, as the heir apparent Democratic candidate for president in order to continue his policies. The selection of Van Buren's running mate, however, was more difficult. The opposition party had their own problems. The Whig Party could not agree on their presidential candidate, so they ran 3 regional candidates. Tennessee Senator Hugh White in the South, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts in the East, and Ohio's William Henry Harrison in the West. In order to balance their ticket, Jackson and the Democrats looked for a war hero to counter Harrison, the largest perceived threat, and settled on Richard Mentor Johnson. During the War of 1812, Johnson was already a congressman, but took a leave of absence from Congress to lead a regiment of recruits to fight the Native Americans in the West, who were supporting the British. Johnson's battlefield highlight, disputed, controversial, but accepted at the time, was the Battle of the Thames in 1813, where Johnson is credited with shooting and killing the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. In the day, this was enough to make him a war hero when he returned to his congressional seat in 1814. Despite being a politically adept congressman and a military war hero, Johnson had a family scandal. His common-law wife and 2 daughters were his enslaved property. Sometime around 1815, Johnson acquired an enslaved woman named Julia Ann Chinn from his father's estate. Chinn's origins are unknown, but it is believed that she was an octoroon, a term used to describe someone who was of 1/8 African descent. Johnson and Chinn developed a relationship and had 2 daughters, but under Kentucky law at the time, they could not legally marry even if he wanted to. That did not stop Johnson from outwardly treating her as his wife, which was unusual for the time. Julia, who Johnson considered his common-law wife, was a devoted mother who made sure their daughters were educated. She also ran the plantation while Johnson was away. Sexual assaults on enslaved women by their owners was not uncommon, but Johnson and Chinn's relationship seems to be different, although there are no records of Chinn's thoughts about her relationship with Johnson, and as a slave she could not give consent. Johnson's feelings and fondness for Chinn, though, are well documented. Unfortunately, Chinn died of cholera in 1833. Leading up to the Democratic Convention in 1836, Johnson was picked by Jackson and Van Buren as their choice for the Democratic vice presidential candidate. But there was resistance. The, quote, crime Johnson was accused of was expecting society to accept his daughters as equals. Despite this scandal and the resulting loss of Southern votes, Johnson was able to secure the party's nomination for vice president. Van Buren went on to win the 1836 election with 170 out of 294 possible electoral votes, with the rest divided between William Henry Harrison and 3 other Whig candidates. But Virginia's electoral delegation had a strong philosophical problem with Johnson for vice president, and instead cast their 23 faithless electoral votes for South Carolina Senator William Smith. This change of votes left Johnson 1 vote short of the 148 needed for an electoral majority. With no candidate receiving a majority of electoral votes, the decision goes to a contingent election in Congress. According to the 12th Amendment, if no presidential candidate receives a majority, the House of Representatives holds the contingent election. But for vice president, that election is held in the Senate. This is the only time a contingent election for vice president has ever been held. In the end, the election was anticlimactic. Johnson was elected on the first ballot by a vote of 33 to 16, mostly along party lines, with 3 abstentions. Johnson served as Van Buren's vice president for his entire term, unremarkably and with little interaction or influence with Van Buren. At the time, the vice president's role was one of obscurity, although Johnson did break 14 Senate ties. During the financial panic of 1837, Johnson took a 9-month leave of absence to return home to Kentucky. He opened a tavern and a spa on his farm to offset his significant financial problems. Van Buren ran for re-election in 1840, but by then, Johnson's political liability was evident and overwhelming. Even former President Andrew Jackson conceded that Johnson was dead weight and pushed for James K. Polk to replace him. The Whigs were all in behind General William Henry Harrison as their candidate, and Van Buren didn't want to lose their own war hero, which might cost them votes. As a compromise, the Democratic Party just didn't nominate a vice presidential candidate, allowing the states to make their own choices, even if it meant the Senate would once again pick the VP. This is the only time this has happened since the introduction of presidential tickets in 1804. Johnson was undeterred and still campaigned for the office. In fact, some say he campaigned harder than Van Buren, but a more rigorous campaign does not mean a better campaign. Johnson would lift his shirt to show off his battle wounds while making incoherent speeches. During one speech in Ohio, Johnson's comments about Harrison were so poorly received that they started a riot. In the end, Van Buren's lack of an official VP candidate had no impact. Van Buren lost handily to Harrison, 234-60. But of those 60 losing electoral votes, 48 did ultimately cast their vice presidential ballot for Richard Mentor Johnson. Thanks for watching.